I never expected a simple family barbecue would lead to my HOA president banning my entire family from visiting me. But when they messed with a federal judge's son, they never imagined he'd use his legal powers to ban them from the entire county. What would you do if someone tried to stop your family from seeing you? The smell of grilled burgers filled my backyard as my sister chased her giggling kids through the sprinkler. After 6 months of not seeing them, this weekend visit meant everything to me. I'd moved to Willow Creek Estates just 3 months ago, drawn by the beautiful parks and well-kept streets. Nobody warned me about Eleanor Thompson. "Excuse me, what exactly is happening here?" A sharp voice cut through our laughter. I turned to see a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair marching across my lawn. Her floral blouse was buttoned to her neck despite the summer heat, and she clutched a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Just having a family barbecue," I replied, spatula in hand. "I'm James Davis. Just moved in. Can I help you?" Her eyes narrowed as she counted my sister's children. "Are these people registered guests?" My sister Melissa looked at me with confusion. I felt equally lost. "Registered? They're my family visiting for the weekend." Eleanor's posture stiffened. "I'm Eleanor Thompson, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. According to our bylaws, all visitors must be registered with the HOA office 72 hours before arrival." I laughed, thinking she was joking. The kids stopped playing, sensing the tension. "That can't be right. Nobody told me about registering family when I bought the house." "It's in the covenant you signed, Mr. Davis. Page 47, Bylaw 3.12. She pointed to my sister's minivan in the driveway. "Unregistered visitors, noise disturbance, and that vehicle is parked improperly." My sister stepped forward. "The kids are just playing. They're not being excessively loud." Eleanor ignored her completely. "As HOA president, I must enforce our community standards. Consider this your first formal warning." She scribbled something on her clipboard. 3 warnings result in fines." I put down my spatula. "Look, I wasn't aware of this rule. Now I know. I'll register them first thing Monday." "That's not how it works. They need to leave immediately and return after proper registration." Eleanor smiled tightly. "Rules maintain our property values, Mr. Davis." My father, who had been quietly watching from the patio, stood up. At 65, Judge William Davis still commanded respect without raising his voice. "Eleanor, is it? I'm James's father. Are you suggesting my grandchildren can't visit their uncle without paperwork?" Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "And you are?" "William Davis, federal judge, Eastern District." I watched her mental calculation. She straightened her blouse. "Even judges must follow HOA regulations, sir. The rules apply to everyone equally." Dad nodded thoughtfully. "Fascinating interpretation. I'd be interested to see the legal precedent supporting an HOA's authority to restrict family visitation rights on private property." Eleanor flushed. "The covenant is a binding contract, Judge Davis. Your son agreed to these terms." "Did the terms explicitly state family members require pre-approval?" Dad asked mildly. "It says all visitors. Now, I'll overlook this violation just this once." Her tone suggested tremendous generosity. "But please ensure all future guests are properly registered." As she marched away, Dad sat back down. "Interesting woman." "Sorry about that," I told Melissa. "Neighborhood politics." "Does she always patrol people's backyards?" Melissa asked. "First time I've seen it. Probably nothing to worry about." We resumed our barbecue, but something felt off. The relaxed mood had evaporated. My nephew Jacob, only 7, asked if they were going to be kicked out of my house. "Of course not, buddy," I assured him. "That lady is just very serious about rules." Later that evening, after the kids were asleep, my father and I sat on the patio with beers. "That HOA president," Dad said quietly. "She reminds me of cases I've handled." "What kind of cases?" "People who confuse authority with power." He took a sip. "I'd suggest reading your HOA covenant very carefully, son." I shrugged. "It's probably nothing. Just an overzealous board member." Maybe. Dad didn't sound convinced. But in my experience, people who monitor children playing in backyards rarely stop there. I couldn't know then how right he was. Or that Eleanor Thompson had cameras installed at all neighborhood entrances. Or that she was already emailing other board members about my problematic attitude regarding community standards. My sister's family left Sunday afternoon. Monday morning, I found a formal written warning on my door citing 3 violations from the weekend, and beside it, a flyer announcing the neighborhood 4th of July celebration, featuring Eleanor Thompson as Grand Marshal. I had no idea then that this was just the beginning, or that my quiet father was already thinking about how to handle what was coming next. Happy birthday to you. Mom's off-key singing filled my kitchen as she carried in a homemade chocolate cake with candles. Dad followed with a wrapped gift box under his arm. Their surprise visit for my 35th birthday lifted my spirits after a stressful work week. You guys didn't have to drive 3 hours, I said, genuinely touched. Nonsense, Mom replied, setting down the cake. We'd never miss your birthday. We moved to the front porch with iced tea, enjoying the pleasant evening. Dad asked about work, and I told them about my recent promotion. Everything felt perfect until I noticed a black SUV slowly cruising past my house. It circled the block twice. Someone looking for an address? Mom wondered. The SUV parked across the street. Eleanor Thompson stepped out, along with a balding man in a golf shirt and a thin woman with severe glasses. They marched toward my house like soldiers on a mission. James Davis, Eleanor called out before even reaching my walkway. Those individuals on your porch need to be identified immediately. My stomach tightened. These are my parents, Eleanor. They surprised me for my birthday. The balding man pulled out a tablet. No visitor registration on file. That's violation number 2, Davis. I'm Martin Greenberg, HOA Vice President, he added with obvious satisfaction. And this is Diane Perkins, our secretary. Eleanor stepped onto my first porch step, uninvited. Unregistered guests are strictly prohibited. We take community security very seriously. My mother looked bewildered. Security? We're just visiting our son. Ma'am, without proper registration, we have no way of knowing that, Diane said, adjusting her glasses. You could be anyone. Dad stood up slowly. I believe we met briefly last month. William Davis, James's father. Eleanor's lips formed a tight line. Yes, the judge. Even more reason for you to respect our regulations. Legal professionals should understand the importance of following rules. Legal professionals also understand the concept of reasonable restrictions, Dad replied calmly. And unreasonable ones. Martin stepped forward. We're issuing a $500 fine for this violation, effective immediately. He handed me a pink slip. Payment due within 10 days. I nearly choked. $500 because my parents visited without paperwork? The first violation was a warning, Eleanor explained with artificial patience. Second violations carry monetary penalties, as clearly stated in Section 7 of your covenant. This is ridiculous, I said. They're my parents celebrating my birthday. Rules apply equally to everyone, Diane interjected. Or they mean nothing. Dad touched my arm gently. James, may I see the exact bylaw they're referring to? Eleanor's smile never reached her eyes. Perhaps you should review the covenant you signed, Judge Davis. This isn't your courtroom. We operate under rules our community agreed upon. Martin took photos of my parents' car with his phone. For documentation purposes. Is that really necessary? Mom asked. Completely, Eleanor replied. We document all violations with photographic evidence. They left after delivering the fine, walking in perfect formation back to the SUV. I noticed neighbors watching from behind curtains. Some quickly disappeared when I glanced their way. I'm so sorry about this, I told my parents. I had no idea they'd be this extreme. Dad examined the violation notice carefully. $500 is excessive for a simple visitation issue. Have you read the full covenant? I admitted I hadn't. Like most people, I'd skimmed the massive document before signing. You've got a problem here, son, Dad said. This kind of behavior rarely improves without intervention. Mom looked worried. Will we need to register every time we visit you? Absolutely not, I said firmly. This is getting out of hand. That night, after cake and presents, I couldn't sleep. I dug out my copy of the HOA covenant and started reading. The visitor registration policy existed, but the wording specified extended stays and guests utilizing community amenities. Nothing about family visits. The next morning, I walked to my neighbor Sam's house. He'd lived here for 5 years. Has the HOA always been this strict about visitors? I asked. Sam looked around nervously before answering. It got worse when Eleanor became president last year. Before that, the rules existed but nobody enforced them like this. Has anyone challenged her? The Ramirez family tried when they were fined for having their grandparents stay during Christmas. They ended up with their garbage not collected for 3 weeks due to route confusion. Then their landscaping violation notices started coming weekly. That afternoon, I found a note in my mailbox. Board meeting Tuesday 7 p.m. Your attendance requested. It wasn't signed, but I recognized Eleanor's handwriting from the violation notice. When I called Dad to tell him, he was oddly quiet. What are you thinking? I asked. I'm thinking it's time we looked into exactly what powers your HOA actually has under county law. His voice had shifted to what Mom called his courtroom tone. And more importantly, what powers they don't have. After we hung up, I noticed an email notification. The HOA had copied me on a message to all residents announcing new security measures, including visitor background checks and mandatory identification cards for all guests using community facilities. The first line mentioned recent security concerns from unauthorized visitors. As I stared at my screen, another email arrived from an anonymous address. Don't fight them. They always win. Then my phone pinged with a text from an unknown number. Tuesday's meeting isn't optional if you want to stay in good standing. I glanced out my window at the perfectly manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. For the first time, Willow Creek Estates didn't feel like a dream neighborhood anymore. Felt like a trap. My phone rang at 5:30 a.m. It was my sister Kate, her voice shaking. Jake, my water broke. The baby's coming 6 weeks early. I jumped out of bed. Stay calm. I'm coming to get you right now. Kate and her husband were staying at my house because their own home was being renovated. The doctor had said the baby wouldn't come until next month. I raced to their room and helped Kate to my car while her husband Tom gathered their hospital bag. Her face twisted in pain as another contraction hit. Breathe, Kate, I said, squeezing her hand. We'll be at the hospital in 15 minutes. As I backed out of my driveway, headlights suddenly blinded me. A black SUV blocked my exit. Eleanor Thompson stepped out, followed by Martin and 2 other HOA board members. Going somewhere with unregistered guests? Eleanor asked, pointing at Kate who was moaning in the passenger seat. My sister is in labor, I shouted. Move your car now. Eleanor crossed her arms. You should have thought about emergency situations before breaking our rules repeatedly. Tom ran up. Please, our baby is coming early. We need to get to the hospital. Martin pulled out his phone and started recording. More violations to document. I couldn't believe what was happening. Are you serious? This is a medical emergency. Rules don't bend for emergencies, Eleanor said, checking her watch. I'll need to see the doctor's note confirming this isn't just another attempt to bypass our visitor policy. Kate screamed from the car. I saw blood on her pants. Call an ambulance. I yelled to Tom, who already had his phone out. Eleanor's face twitched with uncertainty for the first time, but she didn't move her car. Neighbors began appearing in their doorways, watching the scene unfold. Mrs. Wilson from across the street hurried over in her bathrobe. Eleanor, what on earth are you doing? That woman needs medical help. Stay out of this, Doris, Eleanor snapped. This is HOA business. 10 excruciating minutes passed before sirens wailed in the distance. The paramedics had to park on the street and wheel a gurney around Eleanor's SUV. They quickly assessed Kate and loaded her into the ambulance. I'm coming with you, Tom said, climbing in beside his wife. I turned to Eleanor, who was still blocking my driveway. "Move your car now. The board has voted," she announced loudly for the gathering crowd to hear. "Due to your repeated violations, all unregistered guests are banned from Willow Creek Estates. Your family is no longer welcome here." The neighbors gasped. "You can't ban someone's family from visiting," Mrs. Wilson protested. "Actually, we can," Martin said, holding up a tablet. Section 47.3 gives the board emergency powers to protect community standards. I needed to get to the hospital, not argue with these power-hungry maniacs. "My father will hear about this." Eleanor smirked. "Oh yes, the judge. Tell him his title means nothing here. We have our own laws." Finally, she moved her SUV. I sped to the hospital, hands shaking with rage. Kate delivered a tiny but healthy baby girl an hour later. While she rested, I called my father. "Dad, you won't believe what just happened." I explained everything. The phone went silent for so long I thought we'd lost connection. "Dad? Are you there?" "I'm here." His voice was eerily calm. "Text me Eleanor and Martin's full names and addresses." "What are you going to do?" "Nothing illegal," he said. "But no one threatens my family or endangers my new granddaughter." That evening, while Kate and the baby slept, my father arrived at the hospital. He didn't look like the relaxed man who flipped burgers at our barbecue. This was Judge William Davis, who had sentenced hardened criminals and faced down corrupt politicians. "I've made some calls," he said quietly. "The county recorder's office has some interesting information about Willow Creek Estates." "What kind of information?" Tom asked. Dad pulled out his laptop. Their HOA was incorporated improperly. Half their bylaws were never properly filed with the county. And Eleanor Thompson has been signing official documents using a title she's not legally entitled to. "Can that help us?" I asked. "It's just the beginning," Dad said, his eyes glinting with determination. "I've also discovered that Martin Greenberg's landscaping company has an exclusive contract with the HOA. Funny coincidence since he's on the board that approves those contracts." A plan was forming, I could tell. Dad had that look he got before delivering a major ruling. "Jake, I need you to do something," he said. "When you get home, check your mailbox. There should be a letter about your property taxes." "Why does that matter?" "Because," Dad said with a slight smile, "your property taxes fund the county government, which has jurisdiction over HOAs, and I happen to know someone who chairs the county oversight committee." As we talked, my phone pinged with text messages. Neighbors were sending pictures of Eleanor and Martin placing orange cones at the entrance to our subdivision with a sign that read, "Visitor checkpoint. All guests must present HOA approval." "They've lost their minds," I muttered, showing Dad the pictures. He nodded gravely. "What they're doing isn't just mean-spirited. Some of it is actually illegal." When visiting hours ended, Dad insisted on driving me home. As we approached Willow Creek Estates, we saw the checkpoint. Martin sat in a folding chair, checking IDs against a clipboard. "Your father can enter," Martin said when I rolled down my window. "But he needs to register for future visits." "New policy." Dad leaned across me. "Under whose authority are you restricting access to a public road?" Martin puffed up. "The HOA board's authority." "Interesting," Dad said mildly, "because according to county records, this entrance road is public property, maintained by county tax dollars." Martin's smile faltered. "That's not." "Check your facts," Dad interrupted. "I already have." We drove through without another word. But this battle was far from over. In my mailbox, just as Dad predicted, was a letter about property taxes. But there was something else, a certified letter from the HOA. I tore it open and felt my blood pressure spike. "They're fining me $1,500 for pattern of visitor violations and threatening lien proceedings if I don't pay within 30 days, I told Dad. He took the letter, read it carefully, and folded it neatly. "Perfect. This is exactly what we needed." "How is this good news?" Dad placed a hand on my shoulder. "Because they've put their illegal actions in writing, son. And that's exactly what a judge likes to see." I woke to the sound of car doors slamming outside my house. Peeking through the blinds, I spotted 3 official-looking vehicles with county government seals parked in front of the HOA community center across the street. Men and women in business attire carried boxes and briefcases inside. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Wilson. "Something big happening at HOA office. Eleanor looks furious." I threw on clothes and hurried outside. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered, watching as county officials entered the building. Eleanor stood at the door, her face red as she argued with a tall woman in a gray suit. "You can't just barge in here demanding documents," Eleanor shouted. "This is private property." "Actually, Ms. Thompson," the woman replied, holding up papers, "this is a legal inspection under County Code 453.7. We have authority to review all financial and operational records." Martin rushed up, still in his bathrobe. "What's going on?" "The County Oversight Committee is conducting a surprise audit," someone whispered. I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was my father, looking surprisingly well-rested for someone who'd been at the hospital until late last night. "Morning, son," he said casually. "Lovely day, isn't it?" I stared at him. "Did you do this?" His expression remained neutral. "Let's just say I made a phone call to an old friend about some concerns. Judge Martinez chairs the County HOA Oversight Committee." "I didn't even know there was such a committee." "Most people don't," Dad said. "That's how certain HOAs get away with overstepping their authority." Eleanor spotted us watching and stormed over, pointing a finger at my father. This is your doing, isn't it? Well, you'll find nothing wrong with our records." Dad smiled pleasantly. "Then you have nothing to worry about, Miss Thompson." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. 20 years I've run this community without interference. We maintain property values. We keep out undesirables. We exclude family members from visiting their loved ones? Dad interrupted. "Create arbitrary rules without proper legal foundation? Our attorneys will fight this," she hissed. "I look forward to seeing them in court," Dad replied, still smiling. "Perhaps they can explain why your HOA has been operating with bylaws that were never properly filed with the county recorder." Eleanor's face went pale. She retreated to the community center without another word. Throughout the day, neighbors knocked on my door seeking information. Apparently, word had spread that my father was somehow behind the investigation. I explained what I could without revealing details Dad had shared in confidence. By afternoon, strange rumors circulated through Willow Creek Estates. Someone claimed the HOA had been charging inflated fees for years. Another neighbor heard that Martin's landscaping company had received hundreds of thousands of dollars for work that was never completed. At 3 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find a young woman with a press badge. "Jake Davis? I'm Taylor Rhodes from the County Chronicle. I'm doing a story on HOA oversight. Would you care to comment on the investigation happening in your community?" Before I could answer, my phone rang. It was Kate calling from the hospital. "The baby's oxygen levels dropped," she said, her voice breaking. "They've moved her to intensive care. Can you come?" "I'll be right there," I said, then turned to the reporter. "I'm sorry, family emergency." As I grabbed my keys, I spotted Eleanor and Martin huddled near my driveway, watching. "Going somewhere?" Eleanor called out. "Perhaps to see those unregistered family members?" I was in no mood for their games. "My newborn niece is in intensive care. Do you really want to block me again?" "The ban remains in effect," Martin said smugly. "Your family is not welcome here." Something inside me snapped. I marched up to them, phone recording in my pocket. "Let me make this absolutely clear," I said, keeping my voice steady. "If you interfere with me visiting my family during a medical emergency again, I will personally ensure that every news outlet in this county knows your names and faces." Eleanor stepped back, startled by my tone. "Furthermore," I continued, "the county investigators have already requested interviews with all board members. I suggest you prepare to explain why you're using HOA authority to conduct personal vendettas." I drove to the hospital seething with anger but focused on Kate and the baby. My father was already there, comforting Tom in the waiting room. "They've stabilized her," Dad told me. "She's going to be okay." Relief washed over me. Thank goodness. While Kate rested and Tom sat with the baby, Dad pulled me aside. "The investigation is turning up more than expected," he said quietly. "The county found financial records hidden in a separate filing cabinet. Martin's landscaping company received triple the market rate for services, and Eleanor approved payments to a consulting firm owned by her sister." "So they're stealing from us?" I said, disgusted. "It appears so. And there's more, they've been selectively enforcing rules based on personal preferences." Mrs. Wilson filed 3 complaints about harassment when she questioned fee increases, but the board dismissed them without investigation. By evening, we returned to Willow Creek Estates to find the community in uproar. An emergency HOA meeting had been called for 7 p.m. Every homeowner received notice, a stark contrast to previous meetings held during work hours when few could attend. The community center was packed. I grabbed a seat near the back, noting the county officials observing from the corner. Eleanor and the board members sat at a table looking uncomfortable. Due to concerns raised by residents and county officials, Eleanor began stiffly. "We're conducting this emergency meeting to address questions about HOA operations." A neighbor stood up immediately. "Is it true you've been giving contracts to companies you personally benefit from?" "That allegation is under review," Eleanor responded through gritted teeth. "What about banning family members from visiting?" someone else called out. "My grandkids aren't allowed to visit me anymore?" Martin leaned into his microphone. "The visitor policy protects all residents from—" "From what?" interrupted Mrs. Wilson. "From having loved ones nearby? That policy wasn't voted on by homeowners." The meeting descended into chaos as years of frustrations poured out. People shared stories of arbitrary fines, denied renovation requests, and intimidation tactics. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see the county reporter, Taylor Rhodes, sitting behind me. "Quite a story unfolding here," she whispered. "Care to comment now?" Before I could answer, Eleanor's voice cut through the noise. "This is all happening because of him." She pointed directly at me. "Jake Davis and his judge father are trying to destroy everything we've built. They're outsiders who don't understand our community values." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me. I stood slowly, aware that whatever I said next would be quoted in tomorrow's newspaper. "I moved here because I loved this community," I began quietly. "All I wanted was for my family to visit occasionally without being treated like criminals." People nodded in agreement. "But this isn't about visitor policies anymore," I continued. "It's about accountability. It's about whether a small group of people can create their own laws and enforce them however they please." Eleanor jumped up. "You have no proof of wrongdoing. This is character assassination." That's when the tall woman from the county stepped forward. "Actually, Ms. Thompson, we have substantial evidence of financial impropriety. This meeting is now adjourned pending completion of our investigation. The county is temporarily freezing all HOA funds and suspending the board's authority." Gasps echoed through the room. Martin dropped his head into his hands. As people filed out in stunned silence, my father appeared beside me. "Tomorrow will be interesting," he said. "The county judge has agreed to hear an emergency motion regarding the visitor ban." "Will it work?" I asked. Dad's expression was serious but hopeful. "Eleanor and her board have been operating outside their legal authority for years. It's time someone called them to account." Eleanor and Martin cornered us at the exit, their faces contorted with rage. "You've declared war on the wrong people," Eleanor hissed. "We have connections throughout this county." Dad regarded her calmly. "So do I, Ms. Thompson. The difference is, mine are all within the law." As we walked to our cars, my phone pinged with a news alert. I opened it to find a headline that made my heart race. "County launches criminal probe into Willow Creek HOA. Board members face possible fraud charges." The battle was far from over, but for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt hope that justice might actually prevail. Rain pounded against the windows of the packed community center. I squeezed through the crowd, spotting Eleanor whispering urgently to Martin in the corner. When my father walked in, the room went silent. His gray hair was damp from the storm, but his eyes were clear and determined as he placed a thick folder on the table. "Who invited him?" Eleanor snapped, her voice shrill with panic. "This meeting is for residents only." My neighbor Rose stood up. "I invited him. We all did." She looked around the room at the nodding faces. "We're tired of being bullied." Eleanor's face turned red. "This is completely against procedure. Martin, call security." Martin didn't move. He was staring at the folder my father had brought. Dad stepped forward. "My name is Judge William Davis. My son lives here, and I'm deeply concerned about how this HOA is being run." "We don't care who you are," Eleanor cut in. "You have no authority here." "Actually," my father said calmly, opening his folder, "I have copies of every HOA financial record for the past 5 years. Would you like to explain why $43,000 of community funds were transferred to Coastal Dynamics LLC last year?" Martin's coffee cup crashed to the floor. Several people gasped. My father continued, "A company that, interestingly, was incorporated by your husband, Mrs. Thompson." Eleanor's mouth opened and closed like a fish. That's confidential information. How did you get that?" "Public records," Dad replied simply. "Just like the county property maps showing that the community landscaping project last summer was mainly done on board members' properties." An older gentleman stood up. "Is that why our request to fix the playground was denied?" "There wasn't enough money." Dad nodded. "And that's just the beginning. I've uncovered at least 16 separate violations of state law in how this HOA operates." He turned to face the crowd directly. "But what truly disturbs me is the selective enforcement of rules. My son's family was banned from visiting, yet when board member Schmidt's extended family stayed for 3 weeks last summer, no action was taken." Several people shouted in agreement. I spotted Mrs. Schmidt sinking lower in her chair. "This stops now," my father declared. "I've prepared formal complaints with both the county prosecutor and the state attorney general's office." Eleanor lunged for the folder. "You have no right." 2 residents stepped between them. The room erupted into shouting. "Order! Order!" Martin banged a gavel frantically. Mrs. Patel, who I barely knew, stood up. "My husband is a CPA. He's been questioning the HOA finances for years, but was always ignored. Can I see those records?" Dad handed her a copy. "Page 37 is particularly interesting." Eleanor's face had gone from red to white. "This meeting is adjourned," she shrieked. "No, it's not," said Rose firmly. "According to our bylaws, we can call for an emergency vote to remove board members." "I so move." "Second," called voices from around the room. Eleanor grabbed her purse. "This is ridiculous. You'll all be hearing from our lawyer." As she stormed toward the exit, Dad called out, "Mrs. Thompson, you might want to delay that call. The county fraud investigator would like to speak with you first. He's waiting outside." Eleanor froze at the door. Through the window, we could all see a woman in a dark suit standing next to a police car. "You set me up," she whispered, turning to face me. Her eyes were full of hatred. "This isn't justice. This is revenge." My father looked at her calmly. "No, Mrs. Thompson. This is accountability." Martin suddenly pushed through the crowd toward me. "You think you've won?" he hissed. "I have friends in every real estate office in this county. You'll never sell your house, and your property values will crash when I'm done spreading rumors about this neighborhood." Before I could respond, someone's phone flashed. "Got that threat on video," said Mrs. Patel's teenage daughter with a smile. "Should I post it now or wait?" The door opened, and the county investigator stepped in from the rain. "Eleanor Thompson and Martin Greenberg?" she called. "I'd like to ask you some questions about Willow Creek Estate's financial records." As they were led away, the remaining board members huddled together in panic. What started as a simple fight over family visits had unraveled their entire power structure in a single stormy night. But something told me this battle wasn't over yet, and the worst was still to come. Breaking news from Willow Creek Estates, announced the TV reporter standing in front of my house. In a shocking development, 5 HOA board members are facing criminal charges following what began as a dispute over family visitation rights. I clicked off the TV as my doorbell rang. 3 weeks had passed since the explosive community meeting, and nothing had been the same since. "You've got visitors," said Officer Jenkins with a smile. The police had been driving through our neighborhood regularly since Eleanor and Martin were released on bail. Their conditions included staying 500 feet away from my property. My sister ran up the driveway with her kids. "No clipboard Nazis stopping us today," she laughed, hugging me tightly. "Come in," I said, glancing nervously at Eleanor's house across the street. The windows were dark, but I sometimes felt she was watching. Inside, my neighbor Rose sat with my father reviewing documents. "We found something huge," she said, barely containing her excitement. "Remember that community pool project that was canceled 3 years ago? The HOA collected over $200,000 for it, which mysteriously disappeared," Dad added, spreading out bank statements. "We traced it to an account in Bermuda." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Back off or your house burns next." I showed it to Officer Jenkins, who immediately called it in. "That's the 4th threat this week," he said grimly. "We're taking this seriously." "They're scared," Dad said. "The county prosecutor is offering plea deals to board members who testify against Eleanor and Martin." A car screeched to a halt outside. Martin stormed up my walkway, ignoring the restraining order. "You ruined everything," he shouted through the door. 15 years building this community, and you destroy it in a month." Officer Jenkins stepped outside. "Sir, you need to leave immediately. This neighborhood was perfect before they moved in," Martin yelled, pointing at me. Mrs. Patel appeared from next door. "Perfect? My family endured 3 years of random inspections after we put up Diwali decorations. Tell them about that perfection." Other neighbors emerged from their homes, forming a protective circle. "These people destroyed our property values," Martin cried desperately. "Actually," said Mr. Washington from across the street, "I just got an offer on my house, $20,000 above asking. Turns out people want to live in communities without corrupt HOAs." Martin's face crumpled as police cruisers pulled up. They led him away as neighbors applauded. That evening, a knock came at my back door. I opened it to find Mrs. Schmidt, the former board secretary, looking nervous. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "But you need to know," Eleanor kept files on everyone. "She's planning something at tomorrow's court hearing." "What kind of files?" I asked. "Blackmail, photographs, personal information. She has something on the judge assigned to your case." I called my father immediately. He made some calls, and by morning, the judge had recused himself. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters the next day. Eleanor appeared in an expensive suit, looking confident until she saw the new judge enter. A stern woman my father had never met, immune to Eleanor's influence. Inside, Eleanor's lawyer stood dramatically. "Your Honor, this entire case is a personal vendetta by Judge Davis against my client for simply enforcing community rules." The new judge peered over her glasses. "I've reviewed the evidence. This appears to be a clear case of financial fraud, not a dispute over rules." Eleanor whispered frantically to her lawyer, who tried a different approach. "My client was merely following established practices set by previous boards." "Fascinating defense," the judge remarked. "Essentially, others committed fraud before me, so my fraud should be excused." The courtroom erupted in laughter, which died when Eleanor suddenly stood. "I want to change my plea," she announced. Her lawyer looked shocked. "I'll testify against everyone," Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "The developers, the county inspectors who took bribes, all of it. In exchange for immunity." The prosecutor leaned forward. "What developers?" And that's when the real bombshell dropped. Eleanor revealed a decade-long scheme involving kickbacks from developers, falsified inspection reports, and county officials on the take. Willow Creek Estates was just one of 17 communities affected. 6 months later, I sat in my backyard watching my nieces and nephews splash in our new community pool, funded by the recovered stolen money. "You know what's funny?" said Rose, handing me a lemonade. "All Eleanor had to do was let your family visit, and none of this would have happened." Dad joined us, tossing the newspaper on the table. The headline read, "Former HOA President Sentenced to 7 years. County Commissioner Resigns in Disgrace." "Sometimes the smallest injustices reveal the biggest crimes," he said thoughtfully. My phone buzzed with a notification. I'd been elected president of our new, transparent HOA board. Our first order of business? Updating the guest policy to read simply, "All families welcome, anytime." As twilight fell over our liberated neighborhood, I realized that standing up against one small abuse of power had freed hundreds of homeowners from years of corruption. Eleanor had been right about one thing: rules are rules. But in America, the most important rule is that no one is above the law. Not even the HOA.